Thank you, Arya. The purpose is to start in a good way and recognize the land and its importance to our lives and acknowledge that it does matter how we relate to it. We need to be aware of what we are doing and our impact on the earth. I want to acknowledge that in Saskatchewan, we are on treaty land. These treaties serve to govern our relationships with Indigenous people. We have come together today on Treaty 4 territory, which is a traditional territory of the Nehiyah, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and formerly Blackfoot. We also acknowledge the traditional homeland of the Métis and honor their contributions. It is important that we recognize that we all have benefits and responsibilities under these agreements. We acknowledge the harms and the injustices of the past and present. We dedicate our efforts to working together in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. We are all treaty people. And I will pass it on to my colleague Denise to tell us a little bit about SCIC.
Good evening, everybody. So SCIC helps people act on their desire to make the world a better place. We do this by educating people about global issues such as poverty, human rights, gender equality, and climate action, and support people to take meaningful action. And I will pass it back to Jitendra to introduce one of our speakers.
I have the pleasure this evening of introducing Dr. Martin Gaal, who has lectured at the University of Saskatchewan in Political Studies and International Studies since 2012. Prior to moving to Saskatoon, Martin lived and worked in South Korea, China, Taiwan, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. In Belgium, Martin did his Ph.D. in International Relations at the University of Kent, Brussels. While undertaking his studies, he had the opportunity to work at the European Parliament and COPURA, a European security and defense consultancy. Since 2016, Martin has been deeply involved in the development of the Global Studies Certificate and the formalization and teaching of the Political Studies online programming, working with the DEU to create 6 courses. He has also been working on piloting and implementing of the first-year research experience across the department's 100 level courses. In 2018 to 2019, Martin received the University of Saskatchewan Student Union Teaching Excellence Award. And in 2019 to 2020, he was a recipient of the College of Arts and Science New Teacher Award in BA, BFA, and the BMS programs. Over to you, Denise.
I am pleased to introduce a friend of SCIC, Dr. Simon Granovsky-Larsen. Dr. Granovsky-Larsen is an associate professor of politics and international studies at the University of Regina, where his teaching is concentrated in the development studies stream. Simon holds a Ph.D. in political science from York University, and before entering graduate school, Simon worked as a human rights observer with Indigenous social movement organizations in Guatemala and communities organized with the Zapatista movement in Mexico. His research draws on ongoing solidarity with social movements in Latin America, with recent projects focusing on violence against land and environmental defenders, changes to paramilitary violence, and the militarization of extractive industries. His 2 books published in 2019 explore the role of social movements in the Guatemalan peace process and the violence of extractive industries across Latin America. Simon is also a former participant in SCIC, having served 2 terms on the SCIC Board of Directors. Welcome, Simon.
Great.
And before we get into the discussion, we are going to watch a 1-minute video that will open it up as to why some countries are referred to as the third world or developing.
Why are some countries referred to as third world?
Third world state.
Well, for starters, this is how Google defined third world: the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It's often used to refer to poor nations. Not only is it problematic, but it's also an outdated term. It was actually coined in the 50s and first used during the Cold War. First world countries referred to those aligned with the US or NATO. Second world countries were those in favour of communism or aligned with Soviet Russia. And third world, everyone else. According to the categorisation, Finland, Sweden, Ireland and Switzerland were also third world nations. But nowadays, third world refers to countries that aren't doing too well when compared to other nations, that have higher poverty rates, economic instability and a lack of basic human resources. And so third world and developing have become interchangeable terms. But since both terms assume a hierarchy between countries and are coined by certain countries to refer to others, the UN's list of least developed countries might be a good place to look to see what certain nations are struggling with instead of throwing those two terms around so loosely. Or what about this crazy thought? Just call a country by its actual name instead of trying to fit it into a category.
And Arya?
Thank you, Titanda. So we'd like to invite both our speakers to share their thoughts on the video. Simon Granovsky-Larsen has offered to go first, and we'll follow with Dr. Martin Gaal. Simon?
Thank you very much, Arya, and everyone at SCIC for organizing this, Martin, and all of you for being here today. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this chat. I was lucky to be able to watch the video ahead of time and have a few comments that are directed to the video, and hopefully we'll open up a few ideas for Martin and I to talk about. So I definitely empathize with the sentiment behind this video that we watched. It's unfortunate, it's deplorable that the terms third world and developing countries have been used in derogatory and discriminatory ways, in ways that end up causing real harm to people around the world. But what I'd like to focus on in a few points that I'll make here right now is highlighting a few other angles that we can use to look at some very political histories of these terms that come up in the video. So I'm just going to make a small number of points, and then maybe some of those we can open up with more conversation. The first point that I want to make is that I think that the video uses a very inaccurate history of the term third world when it suggests that the third world was a term for everyone else lumped into an almost artificial category, when in fact the term third world was a very political and dignified self-description by people of the countries that we now associate with the third world from the period of about the 1950s through the 1980s. It was a term that was used by a block of countries that were cooperating together internationally. These were countries first on the continents of Africa and Asia that had been through liberation movements and were newly independent from European colonialism. And they were later joined by revolutionary socialist governments from Latin America. These countries together organized in order to defend their independence on the international scene from neo-colonial powers in Europe and North America. And they also organized, especially at the level of the United Nations, to seek political and economic justice in the new world order that was forming out of the ashes of European colonialism. Above all, that group of countries and their political and economic intentions defined itself as anti-imperialist. In not just the context of the Cold War, but in the context of, like I said, an emerging world order out of European colonialism. It's also, I think, important to point that of the terms that come up in the video, the third world is the only one of these that was adopted with pride by the countries and the peoples themselves who fit within the categories that we're talking about. The second point I'd like to bring up is that the video uses the term least developed country without applying the same degree of scrutiny. But actually, I think that referring to a least developed country, a developing or an underdeveloped country is actually more problematic than using the term third world. When we talk about developed and developing countries, we're talking about a single path with an endpoint that is always within development theory and the thought behind putting together development programs, when thinking in terms of developed and developing, the developed endpoint is a Western style capitalist modernity, and there's a single path to reach it. One effect that this has is it ignores the enormous diversity between and within the countries of the so-called developing world, and reduces these to a path of underdevelopment, of not having reached a final point that is attainable along a path defined by a particular economic model. The third point I'll make that really is intended to open up quite a bit of conversation is maybe a defense of using categories. The final point in the video was meant to be a no-brainer. Why don't we just call countries by their actual name? But I think that there's actually a lot of importance behind marking a geographical divide that falls somewhere along the lines of what we call third world, first world, global north, global south, however defined. Instead of calling a country by its name, or using a term that doesn't have a clear association with a particular set of countries. The reason I say this is that if we don't use a category of that sort, we risk losing sight of the unique historical context of colonialism and the countries that have inherited a specific set of disadvantages to their quote unquote development. If we don't use a categorical term that recognizes that historical context, then we also make invisible the power and privilege of the former colonizers and people in settler colonial countries, and the importance, the responsibility that we here in countries like Canada have of acting on that historical injustice and working towards global redistribution of resources and power. Finally, I'll just say in closing that there's a lot of power in names. There's a lot of power in naming other countries in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, historically, it's almost always been done by people outside of the areas that we're talking about. People who look a lot like Martin and myself, white men in countries with historical positions of power that are naming places in the world, and that, as we saw in the video, ends up having some very real world ramifications for the possibilities of individuals and whole countries. So I don't think that as much as there's a lot to discuss here, we're not the ones to come up with the right terminology, but I do think that if more appropriate categories are to emerge, I hope that we listen to the voices in the South, however defined, in naming themselves. Thank you.
Martin, you're on mute.
Sorry, this is what happens when I have a mute button on my microphone and on the screen. I'm very excited to be here today. My work with the Global Studies Certificate really has developed an interest in global citizenship. And a lot of the things we're discussing have very deep ramifications for students who are coming to us from other countries and our relationship with many countries around the world. I'm also very excited that I went second, since Simon covered a few points that I was going to discuss. And actually, I learned quite a bit on your discussion of third world countries. I knew a little bit of the background of the non-aligned movement and how third world countries did have certain meaning for those that were proposing it from developing states. And just the way that I had trouble discussing that is kind of to our point, which is what terms do we use? What role do terms have? And that's where I'm going to end up with my introduction here, is on this question of utility. For myself, I'd always thought of the concept of third world country as kind of an outdated vestigial expression, much like our tailbones. It's there, we've outdated it, we've evolved past it, but we still tend to get hurt when we use it. It's something that I always found to be a bit problematic. But I'm not sure if it's much better than some of the other terms. So, I mean, developing nations, that's not a very useful term when you consider that includes China and Brazil, but also Syria and Somalia. It talks about developing, but what do we mean by development? Is it economic? Is it based in human capital? Is it in social welfare? Can you develop if it's a dependent relationship? If you're stuck into a structural situation where change is not likely to happen, then the concept of developing, being a gerund form of doing something, seems inappropriate. Global South is the one that we often use in my courses. And okay, it's a term that has utility, but it also is wrong. The Global South includes South Korea, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Australia, New Zealand. These aren't states that you would equate as dictionary definitions of a developing state. South Korea is one of the most developed places I've ever lived, as is Japan. The concept of the Global South is homogenizing. I mean, India is not Tuvalu, which is not Mali, and it's not Haiti. It's deterministic. It equates geography and poverty. That you are, if you are in the Global South, you will be from a poor country. It's misleading. I mean, if you were to compare a beleaguered neighborhood in Detroit or some of the most impoverished First Nation reserves here in Canada, how useful is that distinction of first world versus third world, or global north and global south? So there's some problems there, but what this brings me back to is this concept of utility. Is there some utility in having categorizing terms? Again, and this is why my students hate me sometimes, yes and no. It's a shorthand and it's a label that most people understand. It has meaning attached to it. And it's useful in that sense in that it covers a lot of ground when you're trying to have a conversation. Friends of mine who work in the development field more than I equate that concept of Global South to the World Bank rankings of low to middle income countries, again, primarily in Africa, Asia, Oceania, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So they can use this term to categorize a bunch of actors and then get into what they really want to talk about, whether that be some form of economic development or some type of human security project or some type of good governance project. So it has a little bit of utility there. But that utility in and of itself is part of the problem. Institutions like the World Bank or the IMF are infamous for cookie cutter approaches to development precisely because that terminology we're using is homogenizing. It privileges narratives that are Eurocentric. It privileges Eurocentric values and prescriptions. It privileges existing systems, institutions, and actors. And it often does so without consulting those that they're acting in the name of, for those states they are apparently trying to help. And that in of itself can be questionable, but I also do have some very, very dedicated friends working in these institutions who truly do want to seek a difference. So I don't want to paint them with a very broad brush either. There are better and more nuanced approaches. We can look at spectrums, and I think this is one of the areas that if we're having a meaningful conversation, rather than just having some shorthand to discuss, to lay the context for another discussion, if we're really talking about what it means to be part of the Global South or developing nations, or we're unpacking these terms, these spectrums are important. Spectrums of economic development, especially including types of economic activity or economic sectors. Spectrums of human development, human security, and welfare provisions. So we can look at the Human Development Index, which measures life expectancy at birth, expected means years of schooling, and so on. The Social Progress Index, which has 52 indicators of basic human needs, foundation of well-being, and opportunity. We can look at spectrums of inequality, and in particular, look at the Gini coefficient. We can look at spectrums of historical dependencies, colonialism, and neo-colonial relationships, which provide structural determinants of inequality. So what I come down to at the end is that terms have meaning, terms have utility, but we need to understand that terms and concepts and narratives have power, that they set expectations that influence opportunity. Opportunity for countries that have been homogenized by the label Global South, or one of the other terms like developing state or third world country, and opportunity for the people from the Global South who emigrate elsewhere. So while there is utility, and I don't think we're going to get rid of them, I think, and I agree completely with Simon, that there needs to be a conversation where all voices have, and especially those that are being labeled, are able to come up with some of these categories that we can work with. They're not going to go away, but we need to understand them in a critical way. We need to unpack them and understand the power that is inherent within them. And we need to understand the harm and privilege that they prefer to those that are working in the field. So I will wrap it up there, and I'm very curious of what you, the audience, are going to have to say. And ask some interesting questions, and I'm hoping to actually learn a lot. So.
Okay, so I have a question that, well, actually Aria posed. She wants to know if, to your knowledge, what other economic impacts on market or trading access for countries that are grouped in the third world or the global south categories, and how can removing those labels create a fair market? To either one of you.
I could take a quick stab, and Simon can go, or you go first, Simon. Oh, sorry, you're muted there.
I'd be happy to hear from you first, Martin. I was actually just going to ask for the question to be repeated. I got a little bit lost in the beginning of it.
Sure. Actually, if you'd like to repeat it, then I can make sure we're both speaking to the same.
Sure. To your knowledge, what are the economic impacts on market or trading access for countries grouped into the third world or global south categories? And how can removing those labels create a fair market?
I am going to totally flip that question around. And I think the most insidious part of these labels are not the use or imposition of them from the institutions of power, although they're the ones that created it, put it in place, created the problem. What I've always found is that it's an internalization of the label. So when I was working at the Parliament in Europe, we were dealing with a lot of Eastern European countries. This is during the Big Bang accession. One of the biggest problems was the internalized identity or the expectation, the roles that the Eastern European states brought with them. So the biggest limiting factor was not from without, but from within. So one of the most problematic aspects of a label like a third world country or developing nation or underdeveloped or least developed or global south is when the country themselves and the actors that are speaking on behalf of that country fulfill that role. They buy into it, they believe it, and it's self-limiting. And that's the power of language. That language, if it has been so entrenched within the common discourse that we start to fulfill roles that are expected of us because of language. And so I think that flips the question around a little bit. I've seen many limitations, especially in bargaining power between large institutions and smaller states that are seeking to build a relationship with it, like the EU. I've seen how the label has placed limitations upon my graduate students who've arrived from other countries and are not treated the same way as students, say, from Europe or North America, but they've also limited themselves because of some of the self-identity. I don't know, I think that really kind of took your question in a strange direction, but I'll hand it over to Simon here for a second.
So I'm going to take Martin's different direction and take his direction and turn it a little bit and look at the power of language in a different way. And I think here's what I'm going to try and dig into. Instead of the presence of harmful or derogatory labels or inaccurate groupings harming the possible economic advantage of countries within those categories from participating fairly in the economic market, I would say that the actual problem to, if we're going to talk about difficulty in progress to economic growth, the problem is actually the way that global economic relations are imbalanced and exploitative. And actually the terminology around global south and developing in the third world in creating the divisions between rich and poor countries makes for the easy creation of a distraction where our focus is on supposedly helping countries of the global south, the good that we're doing, questions about how effective foreign aid are, which in a way serve to whitewash the real interactions between the global north and the global south, which is that the pillaging of resources and wealth from the south far exceeds the amount that's delivered through development assistance of any kind. So I think that just taking that idea of the power of language in a different way, language also serves to cover up the real economic problem here by diverting our attention away from where the root source of the economic woes of the global south.
And that's also, I think that's a fundamental point, that there's this distinction between critiquing the system in terms of trying to make things some emancipatory or critical theory outcome, and then working within the system of what are the problems and how do we overcome them. And yours is by far the much larger problem that needs to be solved. The system is in of itself rigged. It's going to be by the powerful, for the powerful, for very specific reasons and historical circumstances, for sure.
So is there a better terminology that comes to mind for you, Martin, that would, because I agree with you with on the importance of pragmatic work that does work towards very real benefits with people around the world. Is there a better terminology that would highlight that work and not just lump it into a whitewashing like I've kind of unfairly categorized it here?
For those that I know that are working in the field, and this wasn't my field work, I was very much drawing upon my experiences in Southeast Asia and in Europe, but I have a very good friend this is their life. They dedicate themselves at various levels towards this. And I've had this conversation with them, and when we are talking about specific historical constructs of states, then using those spectrums that I was mentioning earlier were more important to have a nuanced idea of smaller groupings of states, regional groupings of states, individual states, and how they've gotten where they've gotten to and why. At a broader level, we didn't come up with a better term. Global South was about the most banal that we could agree upon, with the understanding that everybody who uses it knows that it's ridiculous. It doesn't factually make sense. It doesn't, as we said, it's deterministic, it's homogenizing, it's misleading. But if you understand the problems of the concept, the problems of the term, it does just provide that shorthand to get into the conversations that they're trying to have. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll flip it around. Have you thought of another term that would be better, or has anybody else that's been joining us today? I see a lot of people here who probably have a lot of experience.
Yeah,
Jessica,
in a typical Zoom, I was just going to say, in a typical Zoom way, our eyes are pulled between each other as the speakers. The audience are SCIC hosts and the chat along the side as well. But Arya, if you want to suggest an approach to balancing that.
Yeah, yes. Tatanda's keeping an eye on the chat, so she's going to throw those questions out to you. And Jessica actually asked a question along the lines of what I'm going to suggest, and it's a term that we have come across in majority world, where majority world is a reminder to those of us in the West that we are but a very small minority on the globe, and with the thoughts in our mind that World Bank statistics say that 80% of humanity lives on $10 a day or less. And so we are calling ourselves the minority world and acknowledging that the majority world faces similar issues, similar problems, and similar economic challenges. And Tatanda will follow up with Jessica's question when you're done with this. Thanks.
So could we jump on in on the idea of majority world first? Yeah, I actually quite like the term majority world. I think it does a lot of what the global South does. it corrects some of the problems of the global south and it presents other ones. I like that it refers to a non-geographically defined majority population of humanity that isn't, that isn't defined by the north-south divide, and so it's more accurate in that way. Much like the global, some uses of the global south intentionally include disadvantaged groups within so-called developed or first world countries as well. The concept of the global south is sometimes used to mean the populations of poorer countries and also poorer populations or disadvantaged groups within wealthier countries also. And so I think the majority world can be used in that sort of way, and takes a further step away from the geographical divide. I also like that I think it has more of a potential to have a politicized meaning than Global South does, in that you can also think about, and I'm just going to go back to the line that I keep bringing up, but you can think about a majority population on the disadvantaged side of an imperialist or neocolonial relationship as well. And so the majority population, if the language of imperialism were to return to how we commonly think about global development, I think a majority world not only can connect to imperialism, but can do so in a way that's more accurate to imperialism in the 21st century, where you have not just the former colonial and settler colonial countries versus the poorer countries of the third world, but a much more of a dispersion of economic and political power around the world, where you have very wealthy and politically powerful people within the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, etc., but even within Nicaragua or Nigeria, there are extremely wealthy and globally connected people in whose interest the operation of the global economic system very much aligns. And so we have a reality of imperialism that's much less clear-cut along geographic lines, and I think the idea of a majority world can connect with that very nicely in pointing not so much to a core periphery, but to, I don't have the right term here either, but an inside-outside of imperialist relations. So, and then it doesn't, at least as of yet, it doesn't have the derogatory associations that any of the other terminology has so far. Unfortunately, the history of the use of these terms has been that each time a new set of terms is rolled out, it's done exactly for that reason, because the previous one had come to be looked at as having negative connotations, and really the same practices and same ideas get rolled out again with new language. Even the terms backwards countries and underdeveloped countries at the earliest stages of talking about international development were seen as progressive terms at the time, and were replaced later by ones like third world and that seemed to be more politically sensitive at the time, ended up having the same kind of negative associations and were rebranded. So I'm not saying that there is a problem with the term majority world, but it's quite possible that the same kind of reshaping of the association would carry out with that as well, which I know I'm going on at length here, but this is the last point I'll make. It really speaks more to inherent associations and cultural ideas that are formed and reproduced in countries of the North, or whatever term we're using, that then end up getting reapplied regardless of terminology. So I mean, more than the terminology, we need to address our understanding and our perspective on the world.
And I agree with every point you've said. I like the idea of majority world and minority world. And again, I think the only issue that it might still have is that homogenizing aspect, but that could actually be a strength in which you alluded to. If the majority world uses this as a rallying cry, uses it as a subjugated narrative to challenge the dominant narrative, to say, well, you're using the global South and the global North, but we're using majority and minority because it distinguishes power relations, and it distinguishes the historical role of imperialism. And if it homogenizes in a way the states of the world majority to see where their interests might lie, and to posit that as a juxtaposition to contemporary terminology, that could be incredibly powerful. And I don't see it coming into the mainstream terminology right away in terms of the institutions that I've worked with. But I think that in and of itself is not a bad thing, because it is a term that could be owned by the majority world. It is a term that could be defined by the majority world. And it's a term that could be used to highlight the inequality, highlight the dependencies, highlight the material conditions by which it emerged. So I think it could be quite powerful. And I love these conversations as well, because as soon as you said that, I'm like, dang, oh yeah, I forgot I had read about that. So it's a great, I think it's a great term in how it can be used. And I think it has a lot of power in that way.
That's great. Thank you both for that. I think a follow-up question, Jessica actually asked this question about the majority world, and the last part of her question would be, are there any other terms that push for a shift in how we think about power that maybe you have come across or that you have thought about?
I'm just going to do a very small point here, in that I think one of the reasons the major institutions prefer things like Global South or like developing nations is because it does disempower the calls for change. They're meant to be politically neutral. There is volition behind these word choices. And whereas I could see a debate in the hemicycle with somebody from the European Commission discussing the Global South, and somebody from a more left-leaning party bringing up a world majority, that might spark an interesting debate. But I think the reason we have certain terms like Global South or developing nation is they're intentionally meant to be politically neutral. They're meant to focus on a European Eurocentric path of development, which others are expected to follow, even if history has shown us that the structural dependencies at play will never really allow that to happen. So a non-answer, I'm sorry, but I can't think of another term that would come to vogue in mainstream use. But again, I think I like the idea of global majority as being a rallying cry within these institutions to try to affect change.
Not a non-answer at all, Martin. I think it was a good one, and I think that the depoliticization of formerly politicized terms is an active, conscious process, as well as at the time that the term third world was politicized and radical and anti-imperialist and taken up by the third world itself. The use of the term in countries like Canada and the United States was very derogatory, and I think that there was an intentional undermining of what was seen as a political term that had a lot of power behind it. That of course threw all kinds of racist connotations and the rest as connected to it. I don't think this is another category term, but the closest thing that I can think of to answer Jessica's question with other terminology that's been used is more of a slogan than a set of categories. But I think that the closest to capturing that feeling that we've had in the last 20 years or so has been "Another world is possible" as a slogan that gets used around the world, mostly by social movements and by transnational social movements that organize together in global forums. So instead of calling themselves something like the majority world or the third world, the term "another world is possible" speaks to the diversity of alternatives around the world and the possibility of reshaping the world according to many of those. And I do think that there's an association with the use of that term that fits something like the majority world. Another world is possible because it's those of us not within the dominant powers in the world, whether it's people in Canada or people around the world, but who aren't aligned with the current world system as it is and the distribution of power as it currently is. Another world is possible speaks to the possible flourishing of those alternatives. So again, it doesn't categorize the world in the same way, but that's the only thing that comes to mind for me, Jessica, outside of majority world and bringing back the language of imperialism.
Thank you. I really like that slogan, another world is possible. Dr. Martin, there's a question for you from Rubina. I hope I mentioned your name correctly. She used the term Global South in her dissertation. She used the Southern theory as her epistemology. And this is what she wrote to explain the reason why she used Global South. It is also important to acknowledge the sources and geopolitical location of the knowledge, because doing so affirms that knowledge of oppressed individuals and communities was historically denied. I do not simply make an argument for the acknowledgement of a geopolitical location in academic work, but rather a consideration of what that geopolitics enables to be known and how it is to be known. My question is her explanation okay, and does it make sense?
I think it's great because it is doing what I mentioned at the beginning, which was deconstructing the term. It is about, I think you could use the term Global South. I think you could use the term world majority. The important part is to deconstruct why you're using it and how you're using it and what it means. As I said earlier, the term Global South I don't think is going away, but for those that have a problem with it, it's about deconstructing why we have a problem with it. And it's about locating the sources of knowledge, the sources of power, and how that has practical effect. That's what we do in academics, right? We deconstruct things to understand and apply that meaning. So I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form on Southern theory, but personally, I would have no problem with the use of Global South the way that you have explained it. It makes sense that it is about the location of knowledge. It's about the history of oppression. It's about the imposition from one upon another. And it is questioning that geopolitical structure.
I'll just add that I think it brings up your comment brings up another important point for me in the geopolitical location of knowledge. In what body of knowledge are we drawing on, both in constructing the terms like Global South and developing world and the rest, but also in how we're thinking about trying to change those and put out other terminology. If we're only looking to English or European language canon of work in political theory or even radical political work, then we're limiting the perspectives that we're considering in how we would criticize, deconstruct, or replace terminology like developing, Global South, etc. And so the work of reaching out to include voices of people from other worldviews around the world in the conversation, and for those of us here, if we're participating in the conversation, of looking actively for translated work that we can approach from people with different worldviews and located differently in different bodies of knowledge and understanding of the processes and histories of development is extremely important. Otherwise, we're only going to reproduce something that looks a lot like what we've already done.
And just a quick comment to follow up, tying those two together, the idea that another world is possible and rooting your research in more genuine Southern voices and theory takes ownership. And that's what I would want to see in terms of any form of categorization, is groups that are being categorized have ownership of those terms, that there is utility there, but there needs to be some, it needs to come from places that are genuine and useful and have true utility for those that are acting on behalf of those of others.
Cindy made a comment. She said, I like majority and minority world, but they are still binaries, value laden in other ways. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I'll just co-opt Martin's point from the beginning. The series of spectrums that you noted, I think, are very important. So instead of having a binary like majority and minority, how could we think that along the lines of a spectrum as well? And as you were listing that very good list of possible spectrums, I was trying to create a category out of the whole of them. Is there some way to, sorry, Cindy, I'm just going to jump off your question and direct another one at Martin, so maybe he can think about them both. But is there a way to take the set of those various spectrums and consider it in a coherent terminology? I mean, something akin to that is done with development as freedom and the Human Development Index. Of course, it's quite limited, and there's flaws with that. But can you think of a way that your broader set of spectrums in thinking about development fit together into a coherent set of terms?
I'm not sure if there's a set of terms I could identify, but I really do like the work on the Social Progress Index, that it is looking at change over time and focusing on the human experience. So it's tying in a little bit to the UNDP's Human Development Index, but it's using a more robust set of indicators. I believe there's 52, and it's trying to plot, not in a snapshot fashion, but over time, how people are able, or how states and political organizations and units are able to use what's at their disposal to improve the lived experiences of the people within their state. And so there's some that have very low resources at their command, but really overshoot and do very well in terms of providing a better experience, lived experience for their citizens. And there's others that have much higher resources. Just look at our southern neighbors that can be scored very low in terms of how they enhance the lived experiences of their citizens. When I was going through this list, I was having the very same conversation in my head, is that can we put them all together?
Can I just say something that's, I think, linked to this? And it actually struck me when you were coming up with the idea of spectrums or continuums, that we're still looking, when we do that, we're still looking at a linear progression. And that maybe what we need to do is actually be thinking about the different kinds of knowledges that are within those different geopolitical spaces. And maybe the models aren't lines. Maybe, I don't know, I'm just, and because I just started thinking maybe we need to think about different paradigms. And I guess I kind of like the idea that Simon came up with, it's not the term, it's the action that's associated with it. I think that was important.
I agree completely. And I have to admit, I have my own blinders in that when I'm normally looking at and have worked in some development capacity, it's usually meant to be goal orientated. And that does have it's already infused with a particular worldview. It is already limiting what is possible. It's limiting that other world being possible. So I can fully concede that point. My problem with thinking outside the box to that degree is how we can act upon it. And I think it does need to happen. I think that does give new opportunities to think of new solutions to long-term problems that we do not have solutions for yet. Or even the problem, if there is a solution, and who gets to define what is the problem. Yeah, I'll just concede the point rather than digging a bigger hole here for myself, because I understand the utility in that clearly.
I'm going to use an anecdote from teaching to support your point, Cindy. It was in a seminar course on development studies, and we had read one particular account of sort of the history of development, and that author used a historical chart that plotted his assessment of the history of development. And then we read as opposite a take on the history of development as there could be, and it didn't include a chart. And so in the class, I asked the students to get together in groups and draw me a chart on the whiteboard that would represent how this other author sees the history of development. And the group that really knocked it out of the park, I asked them to draw a chart. They came up and drew a tree on the whiteboard. And I can't remember what was in the tree or how they did it, but they just turned the idea of a historical timeline on its head and did something that actually worked much better than trying to fit that square into the circle. I had a reason for making that, for bringing the story, and I forget exactly what it was. But I mean, you're completely right. If we use any kind of a continuum or a spectrum, then there's still a developed and a developing. There's two ideal points that we're moving in between, and everything is some variation of those two, and that's not accurate. So maybe it's a circle, or maybe it's a tree, or maybe it's something that, if we're thinking visually like a spectrum, something that better depicts possibilities rather than starting at endpoints.
Throw a really weird pop culture reference out. If you watch The Good Place, thinking of their timeline, of how they understand time, that is, I don't even know if I can conceptualize it.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? These have all taken us in really good directions.
Jeremy Bearmy, sorry, thank you. Somebody just put it in the chat. That was the timeline from the Good Place, yes.
If there are any more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type them into the chat. We have a few minutes left.
If I can maybe throw one point out as well, for those of us that have taught classes in development, I think that's a really interesting starting point as well, which is to think, at what point are we problem solving? And at what point are we asking ourselves or our students to think outside the box to the degree that we can rethink why we have the problems we think we need to solve? And I often do this experiment in my class. I'll say, okay, here's an issue, think of a solution. Then I ask them, well, why do we think this is an issue, and who defined it as an issue? And what is the relationship behind that issue? For me, this is a more of a difficult way to think, because I am a tinkerer. I like solving puzzles and problems. But sometimes we need to think about why the puzzle has manifested the way it has, which is much of what's come out of this conversation today, is trying to think beyond the given, beyond the assumptions of what these terms mean, where they came from, understanding and unpacking the power relationships within them. And I think that is an excellent point. And I think that is partly what Cindy was speaking to.
Now you're just tempting me to dive deeper into the nerdy academic side of development studies, but I mean that approach aligns with the post-development approach in development studies. Instead of competing answers to the problem of development, the idea of development and the possibility of reaching an endpoint that looks like development, defined mostly in terms of economic growth, that becomes the subject of inquiry instead of how do we get there. And it's an approach that criticizes entirely the idea that it's possible to reach development, that development would be something to strive for, and instead, small scale, local, culturally specific, autonomous ideas of the good life are what should be allowed to flourish and don't even need assistance to reach that. They just need we need to back off on intervention and trying to help and trying to define and achieve development.
And if I can give a kind of shout out to one of my preferred development models, and that I've always found interesting, was the Norwegian model, in that they set out a set of funding available to different groups, but the ownership of the program has to come from those that are requesting the funds, that it is a stable funding model over 5 years with a renewal for 10 years, that it has to build capacity, and that in the end, when the money's gone and the help that Norway is willing to offer is gone, it needs to be sustainable, but it has to be defined, it has to be achieved, it has to be put into place, it has to be executed on the ground by local populations that are seeking to define their own form of development. And if maybe more of us could be Norwegian, and we could maybe back out of trying to define what the goals are and allowing groups. I mean, there is still power involved here, in that who gets funding is going to be influenced by what Norway believes development should be. But it is, I think, a step in the right direction anyways. I think they call it the backpack model, if I remember correctly.
Well, it's also important that Norway and other countries like it, Ireland comes to mind, have strong checks and processes of accountability to make sure that they hold to those models. Canada has an approach that's not too different. We have the Official Development Assistance Accountability Act that legislates that all development assistance has to meet certain thresholds in terms of human rights, and there's 3 points. Human rights is the one that I've mostly been focused on when looking at it, but I forget the other 2 points. But we have 3 points that all aid needs to fit into, and we had a similar funding model of project proposals coming to CETA when it existed for funding rather than contracted out ideas of how development should happen coming from the Canadian government. But we have no oversight or accountability mechanisms, and Canada repeatedly ranks towards the bottom of OECD countries in terms of not just how much aid we give, but how effective it is and how well it aligns with accepted principles in development. So a good model, but also some way to make sure that we're not just declaring that we have a good model and waving that flag.
Maybe a question for you, Simon. Have we overcome the problems that manifested during the Harper government's change within CETA, where we were started to look at getting bang for our buck by putting funding into areas where we had companies working? We had kind of Canadian multinationals at work, so they're trying to more align with more Canadian interests. In the last 4, I haven't followed up that recently, so.
Well, I'll give you one of your own yes and no answers. I think that it's less blatant and flagrant, but a lot of the changes to Canadian development practice that we saw in the Harper era were already in process before Harper, going back through multiple Liberal governments and the Mulroney Conservative government also. So, I mean, I think that we have changes in world order, especially associated with economic globalization and shifts in how imperialism and powerful countries operate, that is, changing the political economy of Canada and changing how we want to participate in development in order to advance our foreign policy interests. And Harper took those and ran and didn't hide behind any pretty coat of paint on them. But I think that, yeah, a lot of what we criticized about the Harper era is still in place with the Trudeau Liberals, but was in process before Harper as well.
Sure.
Okay, well, do we have any more questions?
There's one more
Great.
question in the chat from Shannon, which I missed. Thank you, Cindy, for pointing that out. Very often terminology and categorizations that relate to social location and axes of oppression are always in a state of flux because of ongoing contestation. Perhaps in this domain as well, we need to reconcile ourselves to changing categories and terminology precisely because of critique and deconstruction. I'm not sure if that was a question or a comment.
I will affirm that that's an awesome take, that it is that point of contestation, that we need more points of contestation. We take too many things for granted. We have too many assumptions in every aspect of what we do in our daily lives. I think one of my favorite things in first year is just getting students to question their own worldview, which is painful, but it loves to see the kind of light bulbs go off. And in development, we need it even more so. And it's that, again, the only thing that I can fully endorse or would hope to see is that ownership, that there is a idea that states who are seeking change take ownership of what that change means, how that change can be achieved, what the goals are, and how they're going to achieve it. It can't come from the World Bank. It can't come from the IMF. It can't come from me. It can't come from Canada. We need a change of mindset, but we do have issues of poverty, and we do have issues of human insecurity, and we do have issues of the lack of representation. And these are things that I hope we can help and support, but that point of contestation is fundamental.
Yeah, I agree entirely, both with the very well structured comment from Shannon and your response, Martin. I think that we're in a time in the history of the development project where there's a lot less of that active contestation, at least in the minority world, in the global north. And I think that if all of the conditions that shape this to push us towards more of a politicization and a questioning and rethinking of development practice, that's going to necessarily tilt and invite new ways of thinking and speaking about the categories that we're mentioning here, which can only be a good thing. Unfortunately, connected to your point, Martin, there's also a history that anytime progressive terminology that reflects the changing winds within contesting power, whenever that terminology comes about, it usually does end up getting co-opted and absorbed by powerful institutions and reworked to mean something that it wasn't originally intended to mean. And then the follow-up with a new set of terminology as those relations of power and contestation carry on is often slow. And that might be a moment that we're in right now, where global south doesn't have the meaning that it was once meant to have. Majority world might not have solidified or emerged in that way, and we might not be pushing hard enough for different ways of thinking and talking about development.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's say thank you to both our speakers, Dr. Simon Granovsky-Larsen and Dr. Martin Gaal, for their time, for their knowledge, and for their stimulating discussion today on global misnomers. We will be forwarding a survey to your emails tomorrow, and we invite feedback on the discussion event today. And for those of you who are not connected with SCIC yet, we invite you into the fold. Please visit our website, sascic.org, for information on future events. So thank you everybody for joining us today and for the interaction and discussion. And thank you to our speakers again.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the opportunity.